Totally understand. It's kind of like we're setting the stage and labeling everybody, and then getting, like we said at the beginning, very surprised for some reason that they act in the way that we set them up to act in. We have a couple questions we can go ahead and answer real quick, Adam, if you'd like. The
Sure.
first one is what is meant by a neighborhood gun? It might be different from Adam's perspective. From mine, a neighborhood gun is, so one thing that happens is drug dealers end up carrying guns. And I don't know what most people think they carry guns for, but they carry guns from other bad guys, trappers who will tend to rob the drug dealers. So drug dealers are looking out for themselves, and they're looking out for rival gangs, and they're looking out against the cops. They're looking for junkies who are going to steal their stuff and get away with it. They're worried about their bosses and having their counts right and all that stuff. But one thing we did is we elevated a lot of crimes when you have a gun on you when you're doing it. So typically a gun will be placed near the crew somewhere like in a bush or something like that. And then if everybody in the neighborhood or the set understands where the gun is, they can all go get that neighborhood gun. So that's not necessarily attached to any one person, and no one's actually carrying it until you need to use it.
And I would say your police intelligence is very good. So yeah, the community gun is that, and I would add to that is the community gun. Um, for us, we would leave it in a place where everybody would know where it is, and it's kind of like there was rules around its use, um, rules around who could. Uh, Usually, also, if we went to parties or we went to like a strip club or something like that, we would roll with like a younger kid and put it on the kid because the kid wouldn't catch the bigger charge
Sure.
as like for us adults. Um, so yeah, that's what the community wants.
Yeah, somebody may get in a beef, and you hear somebody like, "Where's the blicky?" And that's what they're looking for.
Yeah.
Who's got the community gun? So Mr. Shaw asks, in some communities, we're seeing suburban kids getting involved in gang life, operating drug lines, shooting and killing each other. They don't have the socioeconomic factors that we often associate with youth gang involvement. What drives them to get involved? I'll give my 2 cents, and then I'm sure Dr. Ellis is going to have his from his perspective. But I'm trying to go not from my opinion, just from the data driven and fact driven issue. Poverty, so socioeconomic factors and crime or violence are very weakly correlated. They're not nearly as strong as people think they are. The real strong correlation when it comes to socioeconomic is disparity. So even in America or in Canada, where you can have someone that is making decent money and doesn't have these other stressors, they will they it, they're the it's a relativity statement. So it's about where everyone else around you is. You could be making $50,000 a year, and if everyone around you is making $500,000 a year, there will be this crime and animosity of that will increase violence and will increase especially property crimes and theft, things like that. So it's more about income and resource access inequalities than it is about actually being on the bottom. The easiest way to think about this is there are entire tribes in Australia and in Africa that have almost zero assets, but yet have almost no crime because poverty, they're just working together and they're all in the same boat. And as long as everybody's in the same boat, there's a lot less of that fighting over the sources when somebody else has it and you don't. But a lot of this is gotta come in from the same thing that drew me in, the whole societal thing that glorifies the life as being an option. One thing I talk about a lot, and it's hard to get past with human beings. We always have these ideas that we think will work, but humans are almost always counterintuitive. And it's like the idea of suicide. The more we talk about suicide, the more suicides increase. If you want to stop suicide, you actually have to shut up and stop talking about suicide. How does that make any sense? I can't give it to you, but that's the way humans work.
Yeah, and I agree with this idea, the concept of relative deprivation, which is a criminology concept. I also think it's a big part of it is, as I noted earlier, I didn't grow up in poverty. I fell into poverty. I grew up in working class. My working class community was surrounded by poverty. So for me, it wasn't socioeconomic right away. For me, it was more about surviving the violence. So a lot of these young people in BC and Vancouver, who grew up in these kind of posh neighborhoods, and you know, it depends on how their experiences are overlapping with other people's experiences. So my school, which was in the center of a community that was middle class, working class, and impoverished, all these kids went to the same school. So the number one denominator for everyone in this community was the school. And if you're in that school and you're getting punked and bullied every day, well, you're going to start wanting to develop kind of like a masculine identity to defend yourself from that, right? And I think a lot of these young people who are getting involved in the street life or the drug trade, it might be for selfish reasons. It might be just to have more stuff, and it might be copycat culture, and I want to be cool like a gangster. But it could also be what's happening in the schools around that area, what's happening in that community, right? And how things are overlapping. In Toronto, we're really closely knitted together. So it's always been a joke, right? Like you can't hide from that. You can't hide from death in Toronto. Like you're in the streets. We run into each other in strip clubs and after hours. Like it's a big city with a lot of people, but it's smaller when it comes to the street stuff. So there might be some of that at play. I thought about this the other night, and I think there's a bigger issue at play, and which kind of ties us all together, is the concept of colonialism, right? How are these racialized population or minority groups feeling how they fit into the broader community, or do they feel left out? Are they feeling marginalized? And is marginalization their kind of the off point for pushing back on society, right? For being pissed off at society. And I think there's something to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a multiple factors. Of course, all of those have to play in. It sounds like you're also pointing a little bit towards what the third strongest correlation of violence is, which is local instability. So even if you have these socioeconomic and even access to resources, if you have fatherless homes, you have a violent environment, you have local turmoil like right now. I mean, with COVID restrictions, there's going to be correlations. We have tons of them in America, crime going and violence really climbing the charts, and people looking for affiliations and where they can seem to belong and find safety in a very tumultuous environment. So just because you have access to resources, I would say, is not a reason why you wouldn't be in a tumultuous environment that would require you to cohesively and collectively look together to be looking for strength. Even if you are a big concept right now is I don't see society being divided in the way that I would say the media would commonly talk about it. I really find that our separation is between authoritarians and libertarians, and the libertarian perspective is trying to find ways to let everybody be free and not step on other people, and the collectivists and the authoritarians want to find ways to change other people. And I really get kind of weird when we're talking about authoritarianism and changing people. But if we kind of look at it from that perspective, it becomes clear what criminal justice system is trying to do. Are you trying to make a criminal justice system that is aggressive and is trying to put people in prison and trying to be authoritarian? Or are you trying to create a criminal justice system that opens up doors to give people opportunities to improve on their own? Because if you force human beings, it's another one of those just counterintuitive things. Even if you force me into a good situation, if you say I have to marry Giselle Bundchen, I'm probably going to be like, no, you don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to tell me what words I can say, and you can't make me do these things. So I'll collectively organize with other people to feel stronger. And contrary to a lot of the people that want to help drug dealers, they have to remember that every single drug dealer is a very devout capitalist who believes in the free market. So be focused and align your incentives with those you're trying to help. And I think the idea that people are still kind of going into it might be more of a reflection upon the society that we're creating versus what they're doing. One more question, a couple more questions real quick, Adam. I really appreciate looking at the transformation into combat from both perspectives and how a person can feel as if they are on the right side of justice. Was there a point or person in each of your lives that allowed you to see the other side and shift perspective? For me, I have two very big situations. The first was that when I was working towards my master's in the police department, they started to do this program where instead of giving you college tuition reimbursement, they made you volunteer is about what I was about to say, but forced volunteering doesn't sound much like volunteering. But you had to volunteer at rec centers in order to do that. And when I went to those rec centers to volunteer for the college money, I started to really bond with the kids and kind of started to shift my perspective to think, well, I have to understand that this kid, this 10-year-old that I'm playing basketball with right now, he is going to be that kid on the corner 6 years from now. So I started to see the 16-year-olds and the 18-year-olds and the 20-year-olds as being the evolution of who that kid was before he was completely corrupted, if he was. They all didn't turn out bad. Obviously, that's a minority. But that really opened my eyes to about being more involved with the community and seeing things from their perspective and being a servant and kind of thinking about how I would want to protect that kid. Because if I saw another cop roughing that kid up in 6 years from now, I could see that I would be very defensive about that. And the other issue was the removal of my influence when I was in covert. I did a long 6-month investigation on this gang called the Spider Gang. And I did hundreds of hours of covert of just sitting there hiding right next to them. They had no idea I was there. I mean, I would be I could reach out and touch them. They had no idea I was there. And I would record all day long and I would see the interactions of the neighborhood when it didn't have my presence. And that did a lot for me to see the neighborhood from their perspective and from a what I saw was just a very regular neighborhood that didn't have the indicators of violence and didn't have the ideas of kind of like evil gang members that we were talking about. It really was, you could see it as a family thing, as cousins, as people who were just around in the neighborhood. And a group of those friends who grew up together were kind of clustered and deeply entrenched in this gang. They were a good half of the gang was just because they were kind of lived in this area. And then here I am watching them, but I could see they were just friends that grew up together. They weren't like this mob that kind of actively recruited bad people. It was just a natural result of their circumstances.
Yeah, and I guess the original question was around what were the...
Yeah, was there a point or person that really changed your perspective?
I think like my mother was just always a good person. So no matter how deep I went into the streets, I always knew that I was disappointing her in a way. No matter how numb I went, I would never be numb enough to not have a feeling for her. But then she died when I was a teenager, and that sent me further, way deeper into the streets than I ever envisioned. And that's where I was suicidal, and that's where I was like willing to take another person's life. Like life didn't have any meaning or purpose. And the funny thing, well, it's not funny, but the kicker is in the community where I grew up, like your masculinity is supposed to overcome all of these issues, and then B, there was no services, right? There was no help. So where do you get help? Well, you don't get help until you you go steal a car and flip it over and smash into police cruisers, right? You don't get help until you pull out a gun on somebody, right? And usually, unfortunately, and probably a lot of the audience can speak to this, is a lot of these young people don't get the help they need until they're actually in front of the criminal justice system. And for me, at that point, you're already behind the 8 ball. You're really late in the game. But yeah, for me, it was my mother, and her death was kind of like the moment of my awakening to say I was involved in a whole lot of nonsense and I need to get my act together.
Yeah, I would agree, Adam. You totally need to get your life together.
Yeah.
So we have 2 more questions, but they're tying into this last section here
Okay.
of what happens after the war is over, and the no looking back. What's life like after the streets? Both of these are anonymous so far, but it would seem that a sense of belonging is at the heart of gang life. As helpers, how would we promote that sense of belonging outside of that lifestyle without dismissing what brought them to where they are today?
Yeah, put that on me.
Yeah, you're going first.
How do you develop a sense of belonging? I think this is the hardest conversation I have to have with practitioners. I know deep inside where they're coming from. Their intent is the right intent, and I don't want to minimize what they do. But as a teenager, as a young person, I knew how corrupt the system was already by the time I was in high school. And I was on probation for like not all my adolescence. Every time I went to these folks, I never felt like I was being brought back into the community. I never felt like I was more a part of things. If anything, I felt like I was put into a bucket, a category that I couldn't get out of. And they just made it 10 times worse. So this is kind of like the tension this is where I really have an issue, because it's like we have this system that hurts you and they're trying to help you, right? Like the justice system is hurting you because they're taking you off the street and doing all these bad things, saying you did all these bad things, but then there's change and they're shaking you to change your life. But those helpers who are trying to help you, you know they're on the other side of the team. So why am I going to give in and let you help me? That's not what I was doing, right? And then the people you're hoping that would change your life, like your parents and like all these other people that are supposed to protect you and save your life, are failing you. So it's like, as a person, that's confusing as hell. So I don't know what the answer is, like how you can build better social solidarity with young people. It's really difficult. I would say it's not impossible, but we always use the kind of like the default is planting the seeds, and I don't know if any of these people actually planted the seeds.
Well, I mean, hey, we don't have to have the answers to everything. The three hardest words in the English language to say are "I don't know," and I would say I don't know a lot on this question myself. What I've been trying to do is look at policing from a different angle. So I get this kind of pushback with cops a lot too. Am I telling them that police are bad? Because it's kind of breaking down their identity and what I'm saying about how being ineffective. But I'm not saying that you didn't come in with good intents. I'm not saying your processes weren't ideal. It's just we didn't have outcomes that we really needed, and we need to go back and look at the outcomes to improve our profession. I try to switch it towards improving. If you had the ultimate gang, what would it do? How good would it be? How would it help the neighborhood? Because that's kind of the original intent, is just to get together and have safety to protect people. That's how all of this started. And that's exactly how the police department started. My article in Thug Criminology, coming out, Adam's book, talks about this very same thing and gets into it from a peer-reviewed perspective of what we're talking about in the creations of these things and how they go on. So I don't want to destroy policing. I want us to look at it and improve it so that it actually does make safer neighborhoods. And I wouldn't have an objection to essentially gangs, as we're saying it, be doing the same thing. How's a gang different than the Guardian Angels? Just Guardian Angels has a refined process that's getting to its goals in a more effective way. Mm-hmm. So this is what I argue about for policing as an entire organization as well, is to bring the interests of the shareholders and the stakeholders within a community to closer to what the police department and the officers are actually doing. For instance, typically when some grandma is calling the police to get these drug dealers off the corner, I mean, they don't mean respond with violence and beat up the kids and throw them away. And they don't mean if their grandkid was standing on the corner and someone else called the police on them to just go run and violently beat them up and stuff like that. It's not really what we're trying to do and what we're trying to talk about. So I think a lot of our problem has to do with other people defining these things and defining these missions instead of bringing it local. So the gang is typically a very local organization, and policing's pretty local as well. And those changes you can do very easily, and we kind of pretend like we can't. But there's no reason to use violence. If you have 10 people, you can go get the 30,000 signatures you need to put anything on the ballot. So if in a modern system, really good ideas can be won and their goals can be achieved by ways that don't require violence and aggression.
And I agree. But for me, I would want, from my experiences of policing and seeing what it's done, and I don't pick on policing just on its own. I'm saying the whole justice system itself is harmful to the community. It serves no purpose if you're not protecting the people you're saying that you're supposed to protect. And that includes the so-called gang member, right? So I'm more into the type of work that's being done in the US along these lines of, and this is the work that I did for the city of Toronto. They asked me to write a report on looking at street violence, gang violence, stuff like this. And I draw on the work of Brotherton and them, really around these ideas of street organizations, looking at these young people as not thugs and criminals and offenders, but seeing them as how we've spoken about them today, as kind of like resistance groups and groups that are kind of do have a protective aspect to the community, right? But how do we reintegrate them back into the community, not through a jail cell, but rather working with them in tandem? And I think there's ways to do this, right? Like to get them involved politically, to get them at the table, to make them feel like they're part of the community, to give them mechanisms as ways to transform their group from using crime as a mechanism of survival, but finding alternative pathways for our economic and social success. So those are the things I'm really interested in. You know, it's way better to take a young person and to divert them away from the justice system, sit them at a table and give them new pathways than to like, you know, let them sit in a jail cell and to say we're teaching you a lesson and this has some type of deterrence effect to everybody else. Like that's hasn't worked in 50, 60 years. It's just nonsense, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That the criminal justice system, even in its ideal and most desired form of being a benevolent organization that was truly helping people, should be the last resort. I used to argue about this all the time, and I would be very confused when I was a 22-year-old young patrol officer, and I would get calls to come into somebody's house and settle their family dispute or neighborhood argument. And I would say to them, this is about the most un-American thing you could possibly do. You just asked a 22-year-old kid from an entire another neighborhood that knows nothing about you to come in here and dictate with the power of the state exactly what you must do in your own home. So there is certainly this thing I would like to push towards where people like you and community members do their own thing. And then when the last resort hits, I would like to focus on what the police do, what the criminal justice system does, and ways to improve that. And I think both of our goals should be ultimately to eliminate the purpose of both, realizing that that idea is it's coming to for actual coming to fruition is extremely unlikely, but that's what we should be working towards.
And we also have to be careful of the alternatives also, because in Toronto there's this push towards moving or understanding gun crime through a public health lens. And I agree with this to some extent, but there's also kind of like a whole bunch of colonial knowledge and who gets to create this knowledge, who gets to create this new system, and who's going to be targeted, right? Even my dissertation, I wrote on trauma, PTSD, and gang violence, but it was never my intention to say, oh, all these kids from Regent Park or Jane and Finch have mental health issues, right? Like that's not what what I was trying to explain was the system itself caused so much harm in these communities that crime is a reaction to that system of harm. And along that path, people will experience mental health issues. And how are we going to help those people rather than sticking them in the cage for 3, 6, 7, 10 years or whatever it is, right? Makes no sense. Makes no sense. Like I 100% agree with you. Like I think there's a role for police because if my mother was alive and someone was kicking in the door and she needed to call somebody, she could call the neighborhood OG and the OGs would come and do their thing. But at the same time, like I wouldn't mind my mom calling 911 as long as I knew they were going to show up. But that's another question, right? We have these issues of racialized police responses, right? Who gets the calls, and then how do those calls actually turn out, right? We had a young girl in Toronto who was having a mental health issue. She lived not too far where I grew up. Like 10 police went to her apartment to resolve a mental health issue, and she ends up dead, right? So as much as I want police responses in really bad situations, even in really bad situations, we got a better way of doing it. And I think, I like the idea of like a social work with police force rather than a criminal justice police force.
Yeah, I totally get the concept, and I'm all for the community working towards that. It's just when you need a door kicked in, I'm your guy, and I'll help you do that safely. The next one is, I think, very tied into a point you were just making, so I wanted to lead into this next question with the statement to remember that crime is a measurement of police activity, not a measurement of citizen activity. So even when you are pointing towards crime going up or going down or being this way or being that way, you are talking about is that a police officer wrote down a report that said this happened. It is nowhere close to objective reality. The only thing I base violence and crime numbers off of with any kind of reliability is homicides, and then I would just use those things to infer about other crimes of violence and aggression, and not so property crime and things like that are you're really, you have no idea what those numbers mean. Maybe we could look at trends, but why a trend is going up for reports or not is a very weird thing to look at. So it's important for us to always stay away from trying to reduce crime. It's very easy to reduce crime. You just don't have cops write reports, so that doesn't actually mean anything.
And that also speaks to the beginning of our conversation on definitions, right? Like, it can appear as though you have a gang problem, but it gets who gets to define it and who gets to use this construct gets to dictate
Right.
how big or small it is, right? And I have a huge problem with the literature because I don't know what people are writing about because they might not even know what a gang is, right? Like at the end of the day,
they don't know what a crime is. They define crime as something that's objectively occurring in the community, and I'm like, no, it's a measure of police activity.
Yeah. So there are other surveys that I use, like the victim survey and stuff like that, but I find a lot of inconsistencies in the literature, and my goal at this point in my life is to kind of challenge those things and hopefully correct them a bit. Because it might appear like the Bloods and Crips are at war in 2021, but who's saying that, right?
Right.
So,
No question. So their tie-in was, do you believe the decriminalization of drugs would assist with the dismantling of gangs? If gangs are a reason of safety and community kind of cohesiveness to combat a mutual struggle, I don't see any reason why decriminalizing drugs would dismantle gangs. It's certainly decriminalize. I'm 100% for legalization and regulation, 100% with all drugs. Mainly the problems with black markets, the violence that comes with black markets, and the idea that I feel like whenever we talk about decriminalization or legalization of drugs, we're acting like we're breaking new ground. And I don't want to be the person, I'm not the authority to give history lessons, but the idea of drugs being illegal is an extremely recent phenomenon. In the early 1900s, it was like 1945, I think, when they took it off. It could even be later. You could order heroin right from the Montgomery Ward catalog. Just check it off and have it come into the mail. And we had a lot less heroin addiction at that time and problems with opiates than we do now. Granted, you have the issue with the doctors and the opiate pill over prescriptions, and so that's a legalized market that had some problems with it, no doubt. But we're always, in every example we've seen throughout history, we are much better off in a legalized and regulated market than we are in the illegal black market world of drugs or anything else.
And I agree. I also think this is a very government approach of not, bringing people like me to the table or others. It's just, mostly reaction that sounds good on paper, and I'm with you. Like, I want to decriminalize every drug, but as you're decriminalizing, you have to understand like what is happening to the drug market and how is that impacting everyone who is sustaining that drug market, right? So I remember years ago during the recession, there was a drought for marijuana, surprisingly. But it was really hard to get a pound of weed, and this created competition, and that created violence in the streets around that competition. So as decriminalizing and taking away a viable way for the street to make money because you're creating more competition, will that inevitably lead to increased violence or increased, competition for territory or something or even the streets moving towards even harder stuff, which maybe that's what we're seeing with the legalization of marijuana. Perhaps that the streets gave up on that and then moved towards fentanyl and all these other things because that's what is now available. That's what is the black market. So,
Yeah, you're going to get the black market. You can fix the black, even if you did it with drugs and you fix it all, there's going to be something new
yeah,
for sure.
yeah. So my argument then would be, don't necessarily worry about the decriminalization of drugs and worry more about how the state can fix their structural violence on the community. So how do we create more opportunity in the communities so that young people don't even have to look at the alternative market?
Yeah, yeah, I understand it. It's tough, but sometimes I think we really just have to talk about doing things differently and not repeating the things that are wrong. I don't think it's about having the right answer. It's the scientific method. You test it, it doesn't come out with the results that you want. You move on to and modify it. You don't just keep doing the same thing over and over. And it's the criminal justice system, as we've known it in pretty much the whole world, has just been doing the same thing over and over and over, and then getting shocked when they get the same results that keep popping up. And in the same flow there, Cal Swastis is saying, do you think the ban on handguns, the people that hold restricted firearms license across Canada, would help minimize criminal activity?
They're trying to trick us into a political position.
Yeah. That's okay. I don't mind taking them. The problem with police violence in America, I don't go with the mainstream narrative on this. I think the violence of policing is very much tied to the possession and saturation of handguns in America, not rifles, not shotguns. It's about handguns. And it's a very real reality in America that every single person you interact with from a police officer's perspective can be armed and take your life at any moment. I think that fear has a lot to do with police violence and certain amounts of street violence. I don't think that I've seen any data where removing the guns from the legal market will affect the saturation of guns in the illegal market. I think you actually get more towards a moral position that is the libertarian versus authoritarian perspective. Do you think people should be able to defend themselves and act freely? Or do you think that people should adhere to a collective standard for the common good? I am libertarian all the way through. I don't believe in authoritarian measures. I think something like that is an authoritarian measure that when you talk about crime, no, again, crime and criminal activity is police writing something. So what they objectively do, I don't think would change. But it's not going to change their criminal activities, whether it is or not. If you have less guns, and you were saying that you could get the guns out of the criminal gang's hands, would they be less violent? Not less violent, but the violence would carry less effectiveness. That's the key about handguns, is the concealment is a level of effectiveness, and if somebody has a bunch of high-powered rifles, there's ability to overpower the state at any time for the response. So I think that's a local decision, but I don't think that the authoritarian perspective turns out with the results that the authoritarian perspective is going for. Black market guns increase profit margins for criminal gangs.
And also, so just so Michael knows, we have this debate in Canada because we're kind of going through this with the policy from the government to want to, prohibit, put a prohibition on many of these firearms, especially the high power rifles and whatnot. Just to give you some context, I gave testimony to the Senate on this issue, and I did state that symbolically, I think it's needed. I think the government needs to take a stance and say, yeah, symbolically, we should not have guns in society. Like, there's this whole argument about people having sporting guns and the indigenous population using it for hunting. And I'm not against any of that. It's just living in the city. I don't see the need for anybody to have a gun. And I've been on both sides of the weapon. And, but that being said, the policy itself probably won't do what they expect it to do, because I've never bought a gun from a gun store.
Right.
I don't know anyone. My community gun never came from a gun store. So I think the bigger conversation around that is, okay, so it's like they know that, but they want to use that as a way to justify the other. But then it's also like, let's have a real conversation and talk about how guns are actually coming into the community. Right. And they racialize this too, to say that, oh, it's all the black kids or brown kids that are bringing guns into the community, but it's not. And I don't want to be a snitch on here, and I'm not going down that line, but I will tell you it's not the community.
Yeah, that's I support that argument. Guns and drugs do not come from the low-level gang members. They come from other sources. And that is why, if you've ever done high-level narcotics work in police departments, you will start climbing up that ladder, and eventually some politician will come and put the brakes on your climbing. I promise.
And I will tell you this much. So as I was growing up, and I grew up around, young men who were in the drug trade, and specifically the crack drug trade. I was not a dealer, but I grew up around it. A lot of the customers who came for crack or cocaine or whatever it was politicians. They were police officers. They were probation officers. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, the same people who are demonizing are the ones who are using it. And then we want to crush the community that is supplying it, right? And yeah.
So I don't know if the ladies want to come in and start moderating some of this, since I just stepped on their toes and took over their job. With any of these last questions, and I don't know what our time constraints are, but one of the things that this question here from Eric Osmond I wanted to get to real fast at least is, what is the best way to support youth involved in gang activities? And the idea that we're being physically near them poses a risk. So then when you have that risk of another gang, you need to kind of formulate your own gang so you can get your way out of that. I think this is more of a question for Adam to take up specifically. My personal opinion, and it's just opinion, is that we have to just open up doors. And most people, when doors are opened, they will go through them. It's just a matter of whether that door is truly open for that person or not, or if we're just doing some kind of neoliberal feel-good idea that isn't actually meeting the needs of the people. And data, when it comes to this, is another thing that's very counterintuitive. The data is extremely clear that it doesn't matter where a kid goes to school or a kid grows up. The main issue is their parents. Sure, the school has some influence, but it's very minor. The proximity to the other gang members, it's very minor. It is about the parent and about the local community. So one neighborhood can protect a kid, can protect a bunch of them if they want to. That gets repeated over and over throughout time. You'll have stories of plenty of athletes, although athletics is a bad example, but there's plenty of people that come up through the schools and go to Ivy League schools and make big differences, and they came through the same exact thing, and the key denominator is their parents. So on the Adam, what do you think that you could do with those kids, opening the doors or prevent them from getting in when they're close to violence? I kind of on the outside with that.
Yeah, it's a policy question, and I don't think it's ever been resolved. Definitely, the doors have to be open, and it's a tough one, because if you say one thing, you look like the devil. So I think there's a lot. I think communities need programming, and somebody asked me just the other day about arts-based programming for youth who are in conflict with the law. I think all these things are great, but they never will resolve. Like basketball programs, like all these things. These things are just undoing the harm that's already been done to the kids. Mm-hmm. And these things are just creating spaces where you can kind of survive the times. They're not actually changing anything. It doesn't change the macro stuff. It doesn't change the blueprint. that actually blankets over the community and hurts the community. So if we're going to have real change, I think like there needs to be real conversations around anti-Black racism, around like these macro contexts, around access to education, access to employment opportunities, etc. Right? And you can look at me and say, like, I'm a perfect example, but I'm a fluke, right? Like I'm still in survival mode. I still have a so I can say this much: education did provide me to escape when I cognitively mentally knew it was time to. So it did provide me with that, but it took me a while.
That makes sense. Fiona, do you want to regulate some of our ramblings here?
Good. Thank you both for all of your insights and providing us that dialogue back and forth. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Homeboy Industries, but the next question is, do you have ideas about social enterprise initiatives in our bigger cities like Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Surrey, for current former gang members, such as the Homeboy Industries in LA? And do you think the benefits for the youth and communities outweigh the risks of peer contagion? And so if you're not familiar with Homeboy Industries, or people on the call aren't, it's really initiatives right from the community to employ and have ex-gang members involved in community, building community, working, back to school, and different things like that.
Well, I bet Adam and I are going to be a little opposed on this one. Um, I I don't see data that supports it. I feel like it's more of a moral argument and something that we want to do that seems like it will work, but I have a lot of reservations about it going wrong. This is one of those things where I would stand back and help as much as I could. But if you've seen The Wire, there is the main drug dealer there is Avon Barksdale and his crew. What happened is those are characters based off of real life people in Baltimore. And in real life, that guy's brother, who was very high up in all the gang organizations, went to prison, did a bunch of time, and came out. And he's a big vocal one of Safe Streets. It's kind of a very similar program. And he ended up being arrested again later on, and this happens very frequently, where these members don't actually get out of the life, and then these things can become fronts for them to further their activity. So I'm very skeptical.
And he was actually just murdered this year. So I don't know if you know that he was killed.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
he was just murdered. But I think if you don't do anything, and I agree, I don't think the data suggests that a lot of stuff actually has efficacy. But I think if we don't do anything morally, then we're just starving the community completely. So I think you need to do things. You need to find ways to engage these individuals. But I think it's also at when in their life are they being engaged? Like Homeboy Industries, I'm familiar with it, but my feeling is Homeboy get them when they're a bit older, right? So when I think it was Decker who wrote. He's a criminologist that wrote a while ago. Like the average time a young person stays in a street organization or a gang is 2 years. So I think past that, you're really dealing with ingrained hardcore individuals, right? So the majority will just leave on their own after 2 years. So how much impact can a program actually have to undo a lifetime of trauma and harm? Like, not 100% sold, but I think it's a starting point. Like even my own program, Hip Hop Healers, this is a band-aid solution to undo the harms that the system has caused these young people who have come into contact with the criminal justice. But I can't make any claims that I'm going to stop guns or gangs because I know as a criminologist that the bigger issues still exist, the blueprint still exists. So it's not like a pessimist viewpoint. I think everything that everyone does to try to wrap themselves around these young people is important. I just, how many millions of dollars are you going to put in the community that's not actually going to the youth? And this is where I have a problem. It's like you take $50 million, create 50 programs, but none of those programs are actually touching the youth you need to touch. And those kids would have been better just to give them the $1 million in my mind. Like, you know, buy them a condo, get them out of the neighborhood, give them like some kind of scholarship. If you say you do X, Y, and Z, then you have access to that. So
Yeah, the opening the doors seems to be very effective. I'm a big fan personally of the rec centers. I think when they're staffed appropriately, especially when they used to have police officers doing it, maybe that's a good way to get cops, especially if they're unarmed. I'd make the cops be unarmed if I was there, but that's a whole separate argument. But something that you
uh,
We can still hear you. You just look like those screens on the TV. Yeah, and I think there's other programs that just made me think of it when you were talking. Like in British Columbia, we have some police agencies and RCP that hand out tickets to young people for doing good activities, right? I saw you helping someone, you know, and it'll be a pass to a rec center. So I think that speaks to some of the lower level programs that you're talking about that do make a difference.
and again, I think I think all the work these people do is amazing. But again, it's just like if we ever really want to make a change, because 20 years ago we were having the same conversation we're having now, just with different faces. 20 years from now, I don't want to say it, knock on wood, but most likely we might have the same conversation again. Because if you really don't take care of that blueprint, you're not going to take care of all these others.
Okay.
So I know you had mentioned that education was something that had helped you move on. There's a side of the question that someone is asking. Has there been any study of correlation between IQ and gang affiliation? We know inmates are usually representative of the lower part of the bell curve of IQ, and Gurpreet mentions locally we've been seeing lower functioning youth being recruited to gangs.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of the list, but I haven't taken a deep enough dive into it to make a comment about IQ. I know in the past, research like that kind of like unfairly puts the light on certain individuals, and this leads to kind of social Darwinism and stuff like that. So I try to stay away from those conversations. Michael, they're just asking about correlation between IQ and criminality, and I don't know if you studied it more than I, but I stay away from that. Yeah.
I think not even the correlation. I think it's more that something we're seeing as evidence. A lot of youth who may be lower functioning, we find are being recruited.
Mhm. Yeah, this is kind of like teeters on that Lombrosian kind of criminology of like the backwardness of individuals, and you know, I can show you my report cards from grade 7 and 8, and you would probably say I was low functioning. So thank God I believed in myself, right? Like this is a huge problem. It's who gets to develop these kind of measurements and all these things. And Michael's right. It's like, what do you actually measure into IQ? Like, so
Okay.
I know a lot of these young people through my hip hop healers program are brilliant. They would probably be low functioning coming through the criminal justice system, and they all have like high capacity to write rhymes and all these and be able to put together complex stories, but they're just giving a different way of being able to do that. Yeah.
Just being cognizant of the time, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes. Got 2 questions. So Lindsay writes, it sounds like parents have a huge influence on youth. Do you have any recommendations on how to engage parents and improve their ability to support their children's to leave gang life?
Yeah, and I think there's 2 parts of that. I think parenting plays a huge role, and it just comes down to like love, really. Like, I have a son now, and I think a big component of my attraction to the streets was my father not letting me know that I was a loved person. So, you know, I think if that was more persistent in my life, then maybe I would have had a more attraction to his masculinity and his manhood than the streets. So, I think I think it definitely, yeah. Mhm. Well, my father died, but when he was alive, he was basically a cardboard box that I talked. Mhm.
Our last question. Go ahead.
Yeah, our last question. For clients who have criminal records, especially adult clients, how do we support them in transitioning to living a normal, a non-criminal life, as it would be hard for them to build a normal life with a criminal record and get away from the gang or the game?
Yeah, and I find this, one of the, I think the biggest barriers turning 18 on the streets is getting a adult charge. And once you get that, it's hard to come back from. And I've always advocated for, like, I know in Canada we have a pardon system, but that pardon takes like a damn long time to get for some people, 5 to 10 years, right? And that's a whole chunk of your life disappeared. So I think there's that, like, especially if you go to jail and you went to jail and you did your days in jail, like, come out, you should not come out. And depending on what it is, I guess, but for street related stuff, especially, and this is the whole kind of idea of having this conversation, is to decriminalize this idea of gang. Get away from this kind of criminalizing process, demonizing process, right? These are just kids, and 99% of them aren't doing so horrific that that they deserve like all these days in jail and to have this criminal record that's going to haunt them for the rest of their life. You know, so I would advocate for government to look at ways to create a policy, a new policy, to definitely destigmatize individuals who go through those.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Michael, for your insights and your conversation this morning. And thank you on behalf of Preet Paul and I and Specialized Intervention and Youth Justice with the Minister for Children and Families. Really appreciate all of our participants that have come to this session, as well as any of the sessions that we have had before this and this whole series. We've really enjoyed bringing this presentation to you along with the others, and we appreciate all of you and the feedback you've given us. And we will be sending out a feedback email after this one, and we do appreciate, just like the other surveys given you before, we really appreciate all of the comments that you make, and we pass them on to our presenters so that what you resonated with and what you'd like to hear more about. So that's really helpful for us. Thank you again, and thank you for the generous funding from Justice Canada to allow us to do this presentation series safely in COVID, and of course reach so many more than we would have in an in-person session. So thank you, Adam, and thank you, Michael. We really appreciated hearing from you today, and I see that there's some messages coming in that people are thankful for your presentation as well.
Thank you. And I also had a slide up with my contact information, but if anyone asks, I can send that along.
Yeah, we can share that as well. So thank you. Thank you again, and thank everyone. Stay safe, and let's hope that we get to meet together in this again, and even better if we could do it in person at some point. So thank you, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, guys.